Hello and welcome to the 10th episode of Changing Room Thoughts. I can't believe we're already at our 10th episode. That's crazy to me. I've been doing this for 10 weeks now. If you're new to my content, it's all about critical thinking on fashion sustainability, fashion and business, fashion psychology. Basically, if you've ever once had a critical thought about the clothes that you wear, this podcast is it for you. And if you're returning, welcome back. I post an episode every Monday morning, so you have a juicy 20-minute something to listen to on the way to work. And I hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's a little bit of a heavier topic, as I'm sure you can read by the title. Now, I wasn't sure if I should make this episode because I don't know if my podcast is the right arena to talk about this issue. I will do my very best to be conscientious and sensitive about this. But I'll be honest, I feel like I kind of had to make this episode, even though it's uncomfortable, because it honestly feels really silly to talk about fashion right now. You know, it feels weird to be talking about winter trends or Christmas gift buying guides when there's a major humanitarian crisis happening and a full-blown war happening in Israel and Palestine. I usually start with sharing what I'm wearing in the episode, and today's outfit, while it was not meant to be a glamorous one, is somewhat fitting. It is this Uniqlo shirt from the Attack on Titan collaboration that my boyfriend got me. And I just finished watching the final episode. Why I'm bringing this all up in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict is that I have not been able to stop thinking about Attack on Titan and Israel and Palestine. For those of you who aren't aware, Attack on Titan might just seem like some silly anime, but it is actually one of the most poignant commentaries and pieces of anti-war rhetoric out there that I have ever seen. And I'm not trying to equate the story with the Israel and Palestine conflict, which a lot of folks have done, and I can definitely see the parallels because the story explores the outcomes of genocide and the cyclical nature of never-ending violence. But the topic of war in the past few months has been absolutely inescapable. Some people argue that the Cold War never really ended, but the world is now facing a very hot war in multiple places around the globe. Ukraine and Russia, Israel and Palestine. It just feels really stupid to talk about some of the more lighthearted parts of fashion when this is happening. And while I do not think that this very niche fashion podcast is where you should be getting your news on the conflict, I do recommend that everybody checks out this 3-part series from The Wiser World, which I'll link below, that takes a pretty comprehensive history of the Israel-Palestine conflict dating all the way back to the first settlement of Jerusalem in the area. The reason why I want to talk about it is because I think you have to have an inordinate amount of privilege and ignorance to be out of touch with this conflict. But unfortunately, I think that fashion is the kind of place that harbors a lot of people with that kind of privilege. And I just don't think that that's right for many reasons. Like, you shouldn't be able to hide from this because you think that it's not relevant to your niche, because you don't think that fashion has anything to do with it. I don't think that's right for many reasons. Number one, fashion is a massive industry. And it goes so far beyond haute couture. I've talked about this before on this podcast, but people tend to think of the fashion industry as just Vogue and haute couture and runways, when the reality is that 430 million people worldwide work in apparel and textile manufacturing. And with a total workforce of roughly 3.5 billion people, 430 million of that is like roughly 1 in 8 people. So if 1 in 8 people work in fashion, there's no way that the Israel and Palestine conflict or the Ukraine and Russia conflict don't have some kind of intersection with fashion. Secondly, fashion is supposed to be a reflection of culture. It's supposed to be our self-expression, and it is supposed to be the zeitgeist of like what's happening in our lives, and a way for us to express that through art and through what we wear on our bodies. It's quite an intimate art form if you think about it that way. So to completely ignore the atrocities of the Israel-Palestine conflict is to erase it from this culture, which perpetuates this industry as a place for the white and privileged elite that it traditionally has been. I don't think you should be allowed to hide behind your privilege and conveniently not have to think about this conflict and be put in positions of culture making. Because if you isolate yourself from this, are you really at the pulse of culture? I don't think you can be. My goal with this episode is not to share my personal opinion on the Israel and Palestine conflict, but to urge folks who are hiding or escaping within fashion to face a moment of uncomfortable feelings so we can collectively grow and become more educated. And if you choose to click off now, which you can leave at any time. You could stop listening at any time if this makes you uncomfortable, and that's your prerogative, and that's totally fine. Look, I think I've been guilty of that from time to time, from like turning off the news because I feel like it's too much and it's just like emotionally overwhelming. That is totally fine. But I think you will have a lot more to gain by facing these uncomfortable truths and forcing yourself to think of it despite being in a niche that is otherwise apolitical or unaffected. Chances are, if you listen to Changing Room Thoughts, you heavily identify with being a fashion nerd, which implies that you care to inform yourself and seek knowledge. And you can't do that by conveniently ignoring the realities of the world that make you uncomfortable. Speaking of the privileged ability to hide behind fashion, I don't have a personal relationship with Anna Wintour or any Vogue editor, but I often think about this documentary I watched called The First Monday in May, and it's a documentary about the Met Gala, specifically the one on China through the looking glass. If you're unaware, the Met Gala is basically this star-studded fashion industry event that the Metropolitan Museum of Art holds for its Costume Institute, and it's a big pomp and circumstance. The First Monday in May, it follows Anna Wintour and Andrew Bolton on their trip to China, where they go on this press tour about the upcoming Met Gala, China Through the Looking Glass. And there's this one scene where they were being asked by a local interviewer, a Chinese interviewer, and I could not find her name for the life of me. I tried. And she asked why the exhibit only showed Ming vases and dragons and iconography that was very emblematic of a ancient China long gone and long past. The Chinese reporter, whose name I could not find, poignantly probed on their fixation of ancient China as fantasy. She says, and I quote from the documentary, "Fantasy always entails misconstrued misinterpretation of reality. So the way Western people perceive Chinese culture and how the Chinese perceive their own culture will be quite different from what I gather." A real valid concern, to which Andrew Bolton says after the interviewer leaves, "I think she was really politicizing it." To which Anna Wintour says the absolutely most whack-ass, uncalled for, out-of-pocket comment, "I guess she wants everything to start in 1949. Way to confirm that the only culture fashion cares about is one that conveniently fits into the aesthetic narrative that makes them feel comfortable. The reality is that China lives incredibly different from the dynastic fantasies that Western audiences tend to exoticize. And to just complain that people are making it a political issue is to be pretty out of touch. There's a Palestinian designer, Yasmin Majali, who I think sums it up best, and I quote from Business of Fashion. "Fashion is inherently political, whether or not it's being produced in Palestine. This generation is more open to that idea because it's inextricably connected with climate change, how it intersects with women or with labor conditions or with economic framework. The goal is to have customers thinking about fashion in an intersectional framework to realize there is more than one element to this." I do want to try to educate myself on the way that war, conflict, and fashion intersects. If you didn't care about this conflict, for the sheer fact that it has caused significant fatalities and humanitarian crises and acts of terror on both sides of the conflict, by the end of this episode, I hope that you'd take away a semblance of how these two topics intersect. I would like to reference some moments that show how fashion and war times have intersected and how the fashion industry has responded to international crises in the past. I'm going to reference a lot of moments mentioned by Haute History, HAUTE history.co.uk. So I recommend reading that article, Fashion in Crisis, the fashion industry's response to international crises. In the first couple world wars, of course, a lot of fashion companies pivoted to manufacture supplies for military efforts. So for example, Burberry in London. Burberry would create military uniforms in World War I. Hugo Boss issued an apology in 2011 for the part its eponymous founder played in designing uniforms for the Hitler Youth and its use of forced labor from Nazi prisoners. Coco Chanel was infamously exposed as a Nazi informant in order to keep her business alive in Paris during World War II. As much as you would love to believe that fashion is apolitical and has no involvement in moments of war and conflict, you would be incredibly wrong. One commonality between 9/11 and the Ukrainian war is that they both happened during Fashion Week, and it's very interesting to see how fashion houses responded to these moments of crisis. The tents that were originally meant to show for Fashion Week became emergency shelters. Normal Kamali began creating sleeping bags and coats for emergency services. And in response to Ukraine, generally what fashion houses have done is, number one, charitable donations, and number two, pull out their luxury goods market from selling in Russia. Now, a lot of people criticize the fashion industry for working a little too slowly on this because Russia is a very lucrative luxury goods industry. So it took brands a suspiciously long amount of time to pull their inventory and markets out of Russia. LVMH gave €5 million to the Red Cross. Valentino, Gucci, Kering, Prada Group, etc. all made donations to the UN Refugee Agency. So we saw a lot of European donations happening with the war in Ukraine. The fashion industry's collective response to the war in Ukraine, notably a European conflict affecting a largely white population in a nation in which many high-end brands operate, calls into question the lack of action in the face of many other humanitarian crises. Where, for example, were the donations to those affected by Serbia's invasion of Bosnia in the 1990s or to the well-publicized famine in Africa? It is also telling that while fashion brands pulled together to help the American victims of 9/11, there was little follow-up when it came to helping those in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other Middle Eastern countries whose lives were upended by the subsequent war on terror. While the fashion world has shown it can be compassionate and generous, it is clear there is much to be learned in the face of future disasters. Bringing it into the present day, I want to take a look at how fashion has responded to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so far, from what I can see, there really has not been much. Shout out to Vogue Arabia though, because Vogue Arabia is probably one of the most outspoken about this issue, making its most recent cover stand for humanity, and their November issue pays homage to doctors and journalists in Gaza. Vogue Arabia has always been on point. They have actually always been on the pulse of culture, and I think is one of the only fashion journalism publications that is directly addressing the conflict. Their November cover features traditional hand embroidery from different regions of Palestine in an ode to its culture and a further appeal for humanity, as per their Instagram post. Vogue Arabia has been supporting the nonprofit organization Doctors Without Borders, which is actively working to provide aid to innocent civilians. The Hadids are one of the rare cases in which even the most privileged within the fashion industry cannot hide them from the pain and the trauma from this war. Bella writes in her Instagram post, "My father was born in Nazareth in the year of the Nakba, the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians in 1948. 9 days after he was born, he and his mother's arms, along with his family, were expelled from their home of Palestine, becoming refugees, away from a place they once called home. My grandparents never being allowed to return. My family witnessed 75 years of violence against Palestinian people, most notably brutal settler invasions, which led to the destruction of entire communities, murder, and the forcible removal of families from their homes. The practice of settlements on Palestinian land still continues to this day. The pain of that is unimaginable." One thing is for sure, across Attack on Titan, across Israel and Palestine, genocide is wrong. It is never the answer. It does not solve anything. And if the fashion industry cannot make as simple of a statement as that unilaterally, then we should really rethink who we have decided to venerate in this art form that we consider a reflection of humankind and culture. That's all. See you guys in the next video.